Well, welcome back, or welcome to those just joining us. We want to encourage you to interact with us here in session number 2 of day 3 of our Smithsonian Online Conference. Our focus, of course, is on problem solving, and we're doing so with our Smithsonian experts today. They bring an incredible variety of skills and knowledge to the table, but today our focus is on unlocking the mysteries of the universe, and one way we can do that is through our own imagination, and that's where we're going to focus in just a moment. Remember, you can send your questions into us in the chat area on the left side of the screen. We encourage you to send in comments and questions as we go along. We have a lot of people joining us, so of course it's impossible to address each and every question that comes up, but we will do our best to address as many of them as we can. There's also instructions on how to text your message in. If you're using a cell phone today and not near a keyboard, just send the word chat to 22333, and we'll look for your messages there and try to bring them into the discussion. I am really delighted that sitting to my right is Margaret Weitkamp. She is the Curator, Division of Space History at National Air and Space Museum. She is going to talk about how we've imagined other worlds, and I'm going to turn the floor over to her after first thanking our sponsors, the Microsoft Partners in Learning, and of course Smithsonian Education and the Office of the Chief Information Officer here at Smithsonian Education. I'm Jonathan Finkelstein from Learning Times, and Margaret, thanks so much for joining us today. This is an exciting topic for all of us.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think it's a good topic, and I think it's a very nice one to get to follow Lisa's presentation, which is really about, we're just living in an absolute golden age of astronomy. I mean, the ability to imagine other planets around other stars and to actually be able to see them and discover them just opens up whole new vistas for us. And so what I'm looking at today is as a part of thinking about this grand challenge of exploring the universe, the Smithsonian Institution also investigates ideas about possible universes and about possible spaceflight. And so as an historian, I've always been particularly fascinated. I'm coming at this as a scholar and historian rather than as a scholar and explorer the way that Lisa is. In that challenge of what are the links between how we've imagined what spaceflight could be and what spaceflight has actually turned out to be, actual space exploration. So today, as we're talking about how we solve problems here at the Smithsonian and how Smithsonian scholars ask questions and gather evidence, I thought that what I'd do is take us back to our collection. Lisa's talk was really about the science of exploration and extrasolar planets. My work is often with historical objects, so today I'm showing you a Flash Gordon spaceport toy with its rocket, both from 1947. And I thought that I would talk a bit about the kinds of questions that historians ask, and then how we actually use these objects that we have in the museum as a part of our research collection and also for our display collection as a way to illustrate and also to help us answer those questions, because I think they really put a new spin on how historians think about things to be actually dealing with what we call material culture, artifacts, objects. Because really, just to steal a bit of my own thunder, the answer to how have we imagined other worlds is usually as an extension or a reflection of ourselves. As Lisa says, we can't even imagine what these other planets are going to be like. And so historically, the way that we usually think about this is it becomes a reflection of who we are, and in that way, space science fiction and space science fiction artifacts offer a really wonderful window into thinking about how we think about ourselves, about who we think we are, and about who we think we should be. So I thought we would start out by showing you one of the objects that we have on display at the museum and throwing it out to the audience. What do you think this is? What are we looking at, folks?
And so we have that question up on the screen. What do you think we're looking at here? We'd love to find your thoughts on this.
I see a steering wheel. I see a few circa 1940s rotating space colony, some sort of space modular, model of a space station, model of a satellite. So seem to be coalescing around this is either a satellite or some sort of a space station model that we're looking at. And in fact, the Most of your answers are pretty right. A gyroscope. It's interesting, 'cause a gyroscope, that spinning wheel that helps you to give your orientation in space. In fact, they were hoping that this design would use some of those same principles. What the museum has on display here is actually, whoops, I seem to have jumped ahead. This is the S1 space station model. So this is a model of an idea that was conceived by Wernher von Braun, who was a German rocket engineer who came to the United States as a part of Project Paperclip in the 1940s, and was part of a group of space boosters who were really interested in getting the United States interested in especially human spaceflight. And so this is a model of one of the ideas that von Braun had for a manned space station that would be used for surveillance and scientific research. And the idea, you can see the spokes here, and you can see that it has an outer hub. The idea really was then that this outer hub, as it rotated around, would create artificial gravity on this outside surface so that you would be able to walk around inside the wheel, that you would be able to dock here on the bottom to get in or out, and that unseen here up on the top is the nuclear reactor, which gives it its power. And so the idea was really that this spinning bicycle wheel could create a space station in space that could hold dozens of people, and this is a model that we have on loan to us actually from Disney. It's about 4 or 5 feet in diameter, and we actually do have it hooked up to the motor, I believe, from a disco ball, which gives it that nice slow rotation, so we get to show that off a little bit at the museum. But this comes really from an idea that Wernher von Braun had for some time. There was a famous series of articles published in Collier's magazine in the early 1950s, and this is a spread from the March 22nd, 1952, from an article that von Braun actually authored for Collier's magazine, and it's illustrated by the great space artist Chesley Bonestell. And you can see here that Bonestell has actually illustrated von Braun's idea for this would be the top stage of a multi-stage rocket, for the docking mechanism that would allow, and the transfer mechanism that would allow astronauts to move from the rocket into other vehicles, and then of course again over here on the side a more sophisticated kind of dual hull version of our orbiting space station. And von Braun was really a part of a group of space enthusiasts who was interested in promoting an American space program. And part of what they're really trying to do here through the Collier's magazine article and through getting these ideas out to the public is they wanted to show that it was realistic, that this was possible, that this was achievable. Because as political scientist Howard McCurdy has really shown, the first step towards creating a space exploration program is allowing people to imagine it, to literally to visualize it, to see it, to be able to have some idea of what this could be. And I see that we've got someone from the Blount County Schools asking the very good question of why did the model come from Disney? And that is because that is who built it. This is a picture of, on the left here, Walt Disney himself, with Wernher von Braun on the right. And Walt Disney actually had a series of television programs in the mid-1950s, and they were intended to expand upon and to advertise the 4 sections of Disneyland. And so the Tomorrowland shows became 3 shows about going into outer space. And they actually consulted with some of these space experts of the time, and Wernher von Braun, from his Collier's magazine articles and from his public speaking, had become one of these space boosters. Not the only one, but one of the well-known ones. And so von Braun actually appeared on the program, and Disney built these models in order to illustrate his ideas, and they were used on the program. And you can actually see back here behind von Braun's head is the very corner, the edge, if you will, of our circular space station. And here's a picture of it. The inset is a picture of it on display at the museum. Many of von Braun's ideas did come to fruition. He's considered one of the premier minds behind the Saturn V, which is the 3-stage rocket that was used in the Apollo program in the late 60s and early 70s to launch astronauts to the moon and back. So that winged top stage of the 3-stage rocket that you saw back in the Chesley Bonestell illustration is actually translated in some ways into this very slim section on the top of the Saturn V, which would be the third and final stage of that rocket. So in some ways we're interested at the museum because of the connections with actual space exploration in these ideas about exploration. How did they envision it? How can we trace the connection between imagination and reality? But we're also really interested in, there's some real limitations to these kinds of speculative visions. So this, we're going back to the Collier's Magazine series, and this is one of the illustrations that Bonestell made of what the interior of that kind of space station could look like. And space enthusiasts such as von Braun were really thinking seriously about spaceflight, but you can see they're looking at, this is just one little section of that big, big wheel. They are imagining dozens of people working in an orbital space station, traveling regularly back and forth to low Earth orbit. And in some ways, they were really visionary about being able to imagine something as immense and as complex as this. On the other hand, there were real limitations to what they could imagine. They could not imagine doing Earth observation or surveillance without dozens of people, and they couldn't imagine a computer that was smaller than a room. They certainly couldn't imagine what you carry around in your iPhone or your iPod or your smartphone in your pocket. It never occurred to them that you might be able to do this kind of work without dozens of people sitting up there and without basically telephone operators sending the information back to Earth.
So, Margaret, that's not a cutaway view of my iPhone right now?
No, that's all the tiny little people in there who are doing the work and sending the things back and forth. So, as much as that would be terribly fun. So we're really interested in, at the museum, when we think about what are these ideas, we're interested in the connections between the visions and the realities, but it's a much more complex relationship than that, because these are some very rich ideas that didn't become reality, but that we would call more speculative nonfiction. These come out of real ideas based on real science and engineering about what could be done. But there also have been very fictional, very fantastical ideas about spaceflight, and in many ways those can be just as rich for answering questions about how we've imagined some other worlds. So I thought before we moved on to that I would get a sense of who I have in my audience today, and how often some of you enjoy space-themed science fiction, so such as Star Trek, Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, any of those being the major franchises. And if you would do us the favor of voting here, we'd be interested to know how often you enjoy any of these things.
And as people read through the choices, we are seeing all of your results collectively on the screen. It's neck and neck between our occasional reading a novel members of our community, those who watch fairly regularly, and about an equal amount, maybe slightly less, are avid followers of space science fiction. And we have a few people on either end, too.
Okay, and that's about the distribution that you would expect. You usually get most of the folks somewhere in the middle, and our kind of our tails out on the side here of people who are never interested in this, who I'm congratulations for tuning in and learning a bit about it anyway, and those who are complete nerds like those of us who work at the museum and Margaret, who enjoy this.
We thought what we would do is go a little deeper on this question, and my colleague Adam has put up a question on the screen. For those of you who answered really anything you've chosen here, why? And if you did choose anything other than the first option, what attracts you to space-themed science fiction? So go ahead and let us know what it is that draws you into space-themed science fiction as Margaret and I take a look at some of your responses. And you can type those on the lower left corner. I'm seeing some references to H.G. Wells and his fantastical ideas coming to reality. The idea of exploring space and doing so through some of the fictional avenues available to us. People who just love technology in any form it comes in, fiction or otherwise.
Okay. So I see some people who enjoy these franchises because they allow them to share with other family members. It's something that the whole family or their husband or wife enjoys. Their brother liked it. They like the outlandishness of it. They like the battles of it. They like the imagining what it's like to have no gravity, which is one of the the truly fun parts of the floating around.
We have people who are brought into it by family members for whom it was part of a way of spending time with brothers or sisters who were interested.
Mm-hmm.
Darth Vader is emerging a few times here. So
yeah, it's a particularly good space science fiction villain who has become a great character. And there's some people who are saying they like the connections between the. I see a lot of Darth Vaders. They like the connections between the science and the science fiction, and many of the writers of the science fiction are actually big fans of the science. Also, they're interested in getting it right. And there's the sense that anything is possible, and yet that there is some connection to what people are discovering about what's possible. The possibility of robots, of having your robot companion. I think that a lot of people have enjoyed the idea of that, or being able to speed around the universe. And some Doctor Who fans out there, another franchise that I hadn't mentioned. And so. Yeah, we've got some droids. Milford Middle School seems to be big fans of Vader. Glad to hear that.
So, I think it's one fan in particular.
You think it's one fan in particular?
Yes.
So, well, we are going to we will get we'll talk a little bit about space science fiction villains, because they're a big part of the story that I'm looking at. But at the museum, and I'll give you just a little look. We've got our quiz. Looking at the National Air and Space Museum, and here you're looking at the National Mall building on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. We work with these various visions of space exploration, and we're interested in particular with the collecting, the displaying, and the archiving of the artifacts. And so what I want to talk about today is going to be less about the franchises more broadly, or about space science fiction more broadly, but also about the three-dimensional pieces, those artifacts, those objects, the things that we can put on display. We have an archives and a library at the museum that take care of the paper items, so when I'm talking about this, I'm dealing less with the novels and the short stories and the wide world of space science fiction and fantasy writing that's out there. And as a curator, I'm dealing more with the three-dimensional stuff, the artifacts. And for me, that really means then having to balance these big historical questions about how we envision other worlds and how space exploration was imagined, with the really practical considerations of what is available. How can I store it? How can I display it? And what kinds of stories can these objects tell? And so what I thought I would do is just take you through a little bit here some of these fantastical ideas about space exploration, because most of the objects that we find come actually from the comic strips, the comic books, the radio and television programs, and the movies. There are very few physical objects made to promote space science fiction novels, for instance. So those of you who are big Ursula Le Guin fans enjoy the novels, but you probably don't have a shelf full of knickknacks that are inspired by those novels. Whereas the owners of space science fiction franchises realized that there was a great market for toys, for games, for promotional materials associated with series such as Buck Rogers, which you see a couple of examples here, Flash Gordon, Star Wars, Star Trek. Here we're looking at two images of Buck Rogers. On the left, Buck Rogers as depicted by Buster Crabbe from the movie serials in the 1930s, and on the right as depicted on the cover of a big little book. And actually the very first toy ray guns were made to go with the Buck Rogers comic strips in the very early 1930s. And there's an interesting story about the gun here that we see Buster Crabbe holding, because this is different than the gun that you would have seen in the comic strips. The gun in the comic strips was too hard to replicate as a toy, and so they actually asked the illustrator of the comic to redesign the gun so that it would be more easily replicated as a toy. And so we see here the new design in the 1930s serials that Buck Rogers is carrying, his new design of his gun, which will look very much like the ones that you might have found in your five and dime store. So many comics, movies, TV shows have these lines of merchandise, of toys, things like that. And I thought that I would put the question out to those of you who seem to be fans of this. What kinds of space toys or games can you think of? What kinds of things might we have in a collection like this?
And just we put that question up on the left as a reminder, and people are on their way in already with everything from lightsabers to spacesuits, to Lego figures, dolls,
Yes.
phasers, all sorts of Star Trek communication toys and devices.
Buzz Lightyear, I see. That's a it's a great
Christmas
character.
ornaments.
Christmas ornaments, yes. We have a few. Helmets, so various costume pieces, being able to dress up as one of them. Jigsaw puzzles I saw go by. We have a great collection of jigsaw puzzles. Always interested in what are the images that they have. Board games. So I think I saw some sort of candy thing go by. We almost never collect food items at the museum because we're really in the permanent business, and so food items that are going to spoil on us or go bad become not very good things. So if we collect that, we'll collect packaging, but not the food item in itself.
The one exception I know, although it's maybe not an exception, is if you visit the National Air and Space Museum gift shop, you can certainly find some astronaut ice cream that you can take with
that's
you.
one of our best sellers. So yeah, it's a bit like licking styrofoam, but once you let it melt in your mouth, it's nice.
But that's real. That's not fiction. That's right.
So yeah, the kinds of things that we have in the collection that I work with, you saw there are a couple of our robot toys, because one of the ideas of going into space has always been that you'd have some sort of robot companion. I've got a collection that includes a couple thousand different space-themed toys, games, playthings. And at the museum then, my job as a curator is really to make sense of this large collection and to figure out how that can help us to answer these kinds of bigger questions. And also then how we can bring to the public when they come to visit us, either online or in one of our museums, an opportunity to think about some of these bigger questions and to illustrate them with our objects. So for instance, these are a couple of pictures. I was given the opportunity to create a case at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, which is our second facility out by Dulles Airport. And so in doing that, I was really trying to balance two different goals. One is to have the chance to put on display some part of the museum's collection of space-themed toys, which gives us some ideas about how have people imagined other worlds, and to really work through a collection of about 2,500 pieces or so and figure out what we could put on display. And then to think more broadly about, as I'm sorting through making the kind of practical decisions, also then what kinds of lessons do the players draw about spaceflight worlds or about how we imagine other worlds when they play? Because we ended up with a great set of toys, and that became a real place to focus this collection. So on a practical level, then here you see Samantha Snell and designer Linda King working on actually putting some of these objects on display. On a practical level, I have to sort through the collection for the best examples. Paper items, cloth items don't display well. They're going to fade in the sun. That my job is to keep these objects nice so that generations from now, your children's children could come and see them at the Smithsonian. So we're going to keep those in storage, and metal things or plastic things stand up a little bit better to display. I also then want to kind of think about what kinds of groups of objects do I have that might give me some groups and some ways to think about displaying objects based on my research on each piece. And then really thinking more broadly about what story does this tell when we group these objects together, and then how do I tell that story through all of the little labels, through the little stands, through the arrangement that we work out with the designer and the editor of how can we put these out so that you can see these objects cleanly, so that the groupings make sense to you, and so that then hopefully as you read all of my labels, because I know all of you when you go through museums read all of the labels that we work so hard to write, then you get a sense of that story that we're trying to tell. And what I really found was, as I went through this collection, I was struck by two things. One, that there are really four major types of toys that I wanted to put on display and that we had prominently in the collection that kind of pushed themselves forward as these are things that we need to deal with. Ray guns, spaceships, play sets, and action figures. And in doing so, then I was really struck by there's a strong parallel with this other American genre, the Western. So, which often has this type of the hero with the gun, the sidekick, the best gal, the trusty steed, in this case, our number 2 toy, the spaceship, and a home base that's either a spaceship or a space station, or in the Western, it's a fort, and the villain, who is often non-white or an alien, or in some space adventures, rather literally, an alien. And so what I wanted to do was really explore that in this case, and I thought that what I would want to do today is really walk through this a little bit and think about why is it that when we imagine other worlds, we imagine them so much as an extension of ourselves, as a reflection of who we are. And then what does that tell us about who we are? Because many cases, the kind of classic idea of the gunslinger and the frontier, every space hero has a gun, usually a sidekick, usually a girl, usually some sort of steed. In the space version, it's a spaceship. And there are just so many parallels between the gunslinger image that we see in space science fiction and the gunslinger images that we see in classic westerns. So here we have on our far left Gary Cooper in his white hat, Buster Crabbe as the hero, Buck Rogers in the 1930s. And then even these can be more international ideas. We have Clint Eastwood from the spaghetti westerns, and then Harrison Ford as Han Solo in the Star Wars franchise. And so in many ways, when we look at these fantastical space science fiction stories, especially as they're depicted in movies and television in the late 20th century in the United States, these tales are actually in many ways much less about faraway places and planets, because we didn't even have the ideas about extrasolar planets until only the last few years about them as reality, and so they become much more about Americans' ideas of themselves. And I was really struck that the central piece of all of these, if you look at all of these images, in many ways, the ray gun. And in fact, when I looked at the collection, we have a very large collection of toy ray guns of all different sizes and shapes, colors, configurations, that are supposed to be able to blast you into laser death with any number of either nuclear power or lasers or rays or all kinds of fantastical, futuristic death technologies at your side. And so in some ways, if you just kind of look at it, I mean, ray guns are a kind of ridiculous thing to have aboard a spaceship. You would never fire a projectile inside a pressurized ship. Space is a very bad place to have a weapon, and as it was pointed out to me by some of my colleagues at the museum who work with more military stuff, a pistol like this, a small ray gun, is really a close-range weapon. So in the vastness of space, when you're looking at these kind of big things, this is not a very practical weapon, and yet every space hero has a ray gun. And so one of the questions for me, as I wanted to put this on display, is what do we do with this? How do we make sense of this? And this connection that you see between the Western and space science fiction. I see someone, a fan of Firefly out in Portland, pointing out that Joss Whedon franchise that became really a space Western. He put those two together very directly, and that really resonates in an American context. And so if you'll forgive me a little diversion into kind of some pure U.S. history here, it's really rooted in American beliefs about the frontier and the importance of the frontier. And Frederick Jackson Turner was an American historian who gave a very important paper at the American Historical Association in 1893. And he looked at, according to the 1890 census, the frontier was closed. There was no more unexplored, unsettled land in the continuous United States, which in 1893 was all of the United States. And so he looked at that and he said, this is a turning point in American history, or we are witnessing in the moment in 1893 this turning point in U.S. history where We are moving from a time when the frontier has shaped American identity to this new future we don't know much about, where more people live in cities, fewer people live on farms, and there is no unexplored space yet. And Frederick Jackson Turner, what became known as the Turner thesis, the Turner frontier thesis, really said that American success in many ways was tied to that westward expansion, because the American national culture really became defined by the dynamic of the frontier, by that meeting of the wilderness and civilization. And that, in fact, the unique quality of American citizens, those people who are hardy enough to beat back and civilize the wilderness, and who are shaped then by that fortifying, by that strengthening experience of encountering the wilderness, that is something core about who Americans are. Now, this is something that historians have debated a lot, especially recently. Newer scholars such as Patricia Limerick, who's a historian of the American West, points out there are a lot of problems with this thesis. The West was never completely unoccupied. This ignores Native American history. This is a focus that is very biased towards the East Coast, this kind of east to west migration, as if that was the only direction. So we tend to think of this more as the myth of the American frontier now than as some truth. But other scholars have also argued that there is a sense of American identity that is not just an abstract idea, but that this frontier idea has become a powerful one that is even a part of our foreign policy. So Richard Slotkin's book, Gunfighter Nation, really talks about the importance of Americans' ideas of themselves being formed with the frontier and being something that we still think of as important. And in fact, this idea of American exceptionalism, of the America's uniqueness, sometimes tied to divine will, that America is a city on the hill by God's grace, sometimes tied to our geographic or historic circumstances, that we're on this landmass that is surrounded by two oceans, also came out of this idea held by the founders, and here we see Thomas Jefferson on our left, the idea that the United States could escape some of the problems of the old world because of available land. And so if you lived in the old country and your family had a farm and you had 3 sons, then you either divided the farm 3 ways, and you eventually, a couple generations later, had patches of land that were so small they couldn't sustain anybody, or you had to have these old world laws about inheritance that only the first son got land and the rest of the sons had to find some other trade or join the clergy, and that this limited economic opportunity for those who were not fortunate enough to be first sons or who were not already in a family that had substantial land. And so Thomas Jefferson, when he bought the Louisiana Purchase, that huge purchase of land west of the Mississippi in 1803, said he has purchased an empire for liberty. He thought it would take 100 generations for Americans to fill the West. It turned out, as we know from Frederick Jackson Turner in the 1890 census, to take less than 100 generations, to take more like 87 years. But he thought that this kind of space would be the pressure valve for the United States. There would always be a place where anyone who with the ambition could go and they would find themselves a space. And there are some real ways in which, when we look at how do we imagine other worlds, one of the things is that people have often thought about the idea of outer space as some extension of this pressure valve for the United States. This idea of being the human race is destined to move out into the universe, and that in some ways this extra space, this outer space, is going to be an extension of this same idea of being able to move out to the West, being able to have that breathing room, the room to establish someplace new.
Margaret, quick question on point from Margaret in Oregon, talking of the West.
Yeah.
Are the toys and other space and science fiction memorabilia an American phenomenon, or does this fascination also appear in Asian, South American, African, or other cultures?
It flourishes in the United States in a slightly different way. It takes on a different cast in other nations. So, for instance, toys that are made in Japan in the post-war period, which are often seen as atomic men, and which in a Japanese context are interpreted more in terms of the history of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Japanese cultural dealing with having been the only country in the world to have been the recipient of nuclear weapons. those toys would be sold as there's a set of characters in Japanese culture that are the kind of the robot with a human heart, or the atomic powered an atomic powered robot that is in fact very human and very vulnerable, and a boy that has this very good heart, and it becomes a core character. Many of those same toys get sold in the United States, and they become astronauts. And they are sold in a way that fits in more with how we think about this. So there are definitely interests in space science fiction in other parts in the world. I think what's so fascinating about it, and what as an historian I think is fascinating, is the way in which they resonate so much out of their own context. So I see people pointing out in the spaghetti westerns, that's taking an American form, and it's an Italian set of filmmakers who are making those films in the 60s and 70s. There are a lot of parallels between the space science fiction and the samurai stories that get told, again, out of a more Asian context. And they are playing back and forth with different interpretations of very similar ideas. So it's a great question. And it's one that really, when we're trying to deal with this at the museum, we're interested in what are all of the possibilities, but then also what does this tell us about, in this case, about American culture, and about how these are rooted in that. Because within 10 years of Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier thesis, we see the beginning of the American Western as a genre. So on the left here, we see a film adaptation, a 1929 film starring Gary Cooper, of The Virginian. And The Virginian, Owen Wister's novel from 1902, is considered to be kind of the prototypical Western novel. It sets many of the conventions for the genre. Smile when you say that, partner. A line that comes out of that, which when you read in that, you think, oh, how cliched, and then you realize, no, he's the first one writing it. It's just everyone else has aped it since then. And it sets many of the conventions that you then also see in American space science fiction as depicted in movies and radio serials and television. And so on the right-hand side of here have a 1939 advertisement for a Buck Rogers film, again starring Buster Crabbe. And that Buck Rogers franchise is a very important escapist science fiction that's born of a 1928 short story, and that becomes very quickly advanced through comic strips and movie serials and radio programs. So as I think about space science fiction and its place in American culture, I then keep coming back to these ray guns. And trying to figure out, how do I make sense of this? And in the case, as you remember, I was putting our case together of space science fiction toys for the Udvar-Hazy Center. One of the questions is, what do I do with these? And one of the solutions that we came up with is I wanted a kind of a visually interesting display of toy ray guns that gave us an opportunity to identify each one. But then also to kind of pull these out of time, to put them out as a type, the ray guns in all of their array of colors, and then to point them all in towards my label, which really talks about this connection with Westerns. And one of the things when I worked with the exhibit designers, I said, this cannot look like a gun rack. This needs to visually, from across the room, look like something that's fantastical, something that's kind of fun, and people need to be able to see this. So I thought we also wanted to give people a chance to look at the question, how do you know these are ray guns? What about them, when you look at them, when you see them, if you came to the Udvar-Hazy Center, which I hope you will, and you see these in the case from across the room, how do you know it's ray guns and not something more serious or some other type of weapon?
And so let's look at this array of ray guns from the case here and think about these objects and what about them makes them ray guns. How do we identify them? So go ahead and let us know in the chat box on the left, seeing a lot of people referring to their overall shape. For those who said shape, tell us a little bit more. What about their shape makes them specifically, in your mind, jump out as a ray gun without much more examination? What else do we see here? The colors, we're hearing from people, thank you, Jennifer, that they're brightly colored. We have some elaboration on the shape, that they tend to be round.
Yes, the roundness is part of it. definitely.
Weird shapes. Again,
Yes.
If you want to elaborate, feel free, but I think we follow you there.
Mm-hmm.
The oval chambers, as someone from Davenport is mentioning. An extreme power source.
Yes. One of the things that we tend to find is that these the idea of the technology of the ray gun often follows whatever's new. So it's in the immediate post-war period that we, after World War II, that you start seeing atomic guns, nuclear guns. It's starting in 1960. If you look at kind of our 10 o'clock position, we've got a white gun up there. And we also have another one at the kind of 1 o'clock position that are both supposed to be laser guns. Lasers being invented in 1960 and then very quickly creeping into the ray gun fantasy as the newest, latest science that can be imagined in this new way. But in many ways, the fins, the roundness, the bright colors is often part of what these are. Many of the older versions of these guns, as the actual toys, shoot sparks or something. That some of these are actually water guns. Our bright yellow and red one up here. And then again, you see it's the same gun with a different finish. Down here are actually water guns from the 1930s, so there's actually a leather pouch inside those metal guns that holds the water and allows you to shoot it. So I wanted to put the ray guns on display in this way, but I also wanted to really think about, who are the characters who are in this, and how do we think about when we play with these kinds of toys, how do we think about point of view? So I'm very interested in men's and women's roles. So again, Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon, looking at Wilma Deering here on the left in a 1936 trading card, or the kind of square-jawed, powerful, muscular masculinity that we see in our Flash Gordon comic in the center here, or the very interesting case in the movie Alien from 1979 of Sigourney Weaver, the female actor playing a role that was originally written for a man, and then, as I understand it, not terribly rewritten in order for her to play it. So there's an interesting vulnerability that comes out when she plays that role, even when she's acting the lines that were written for a man to speak. But as we think about point of view, we also think about, where do the ideas for villains come? How do they change? And if you look at this, in this case, we're looking at Ming the Merciless, at various versions of this character from the Flash Gordon series, who was the despot leader of the planet Mungo and the dire enemy of Flash Gordon. Buck Rogers is also fighting the Mongol hordes. There's a real reflection here of the anti-Asian sentiment and stereotypes that you see in the 1930s with the choice of this stereotypical Asian supervillain, which is in many ways a close relationship to the Fu Manchu archetype of the same period. And so in the 1930s serials, you also have Buck Rogers fighting Killer Kane, who's a gangster, another reflection of the time of who they're thinking about as the villain at the time. And I really think it's interesting then, as you look at how these franchises get resurrected in the 1950s and 1960s, or again in the 1980s. By the 1979 version of Flash Gordon, Ming the Merciless is no longer Asian. He's more reptilian. He's more alien, and so because it's unacceptable in the late 1970s to have the mustache twirling stereotypical Asian supervillain. And as we think about these toys, it really reinforces the point of view that we are the heroes. If you are carrying the ray gun, then you are enacting the role of the hero. And most often when the ray guns or those toys are put together, you're put in the position of being the hero, and imagine yourself as the muscular blonde Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon, or the lead of this. Can't talk about this without talking about Star Trek. If the gunslinger frontier context is clear when we look at Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon in the 1930s, it's equally so in the 1960s. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, actually pitched the show as Wagon Train to the Stars. He was modeling it on the idea of a Western. And he was really thinking about it becoming a agent for social change. He was interested in making comments about, for instance, the crew, which you see here, part of the original crew, which is a gender integrated, racially integrated international crew that in fact includes an alien in 1966. So at the same moment in the middle of the civil rights movement, as the women's movement is just beginning, we've got this vision of this kind of integration and harmony in space. He's trying very self-consciously to extrapolate what he hopes will be some of the changes that are happening in the present into the future. And yet, it's still, anyone who's watched any part of the animated series, the 4 additional television programs, the 11 movies, all of the merchandising, the fan culture that comes with the Star Trek universe, really still understand that this is still the phasers at the ready gunslinger idea. And so I have to ask, because I know there are Trek fans out there, does anyone know what these are?
There are some instantaneous responses.
Oh,
we're separating the Trekkies from everyone else. I'm sorry.
Yes.
I wasn't everybody else, I have to tell you.
And so, yes, in fact, these are tribbles. So these are one other vision of alien life. Yeah, little balls of fur, very much. They are, and they're just one example of the aliens as not us. These are little balls of fur that are part of the Trouble with Tribbles episode from the original Star Trek series. In many ways, when we talk about aliens, sometimes it's racialized, sometimes it's an other that is like Ming the Merciless, not us, and you can define, then think about who we think we are based on who we're saying we're not. So in the 1930s, that sense that the us is not Asian. In some ways, this can sometimes be feminized. The us is male, and the not us is feminized. Tribbles only, exist only to eat and reproduce. And we at the museum actually have examples of some original Tribble props that were given to us. But as we think about that perspective, that point of view, then when you look at the toys, I think it's valuable, again, to think about that point of view. Who are you? When you're holding the ray gun, you are the hero. You're playing out that role. It's a very different experience if you're playing with a play set, such as this fort-like play set based on the 1950s radio and television program Space Patrol. And so in this, you're encouraged to direct the action from above. And again, you can see these parallels with the Western, especially in the American context. This is, the space play set, and it's clear as a fort, with the wall around it and the big building in the middle and all of our various play people and cars and things. You could easily see this being a Western style play set. And many of the, especially 1950s, 1960s play sets echo that connection with the Westerns. But we see the same kind of point of view when we look at action figures, such as these ones from Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back, which allows the player to stand over all of the characters and to reenact the scenes for the film, or in fact to invent other ones. And in this way, the player is the author, not the participant, not the role player. And in fact, these toys were marketed in a way to encourage people to buy lots of them. You didn't just buy one character and pretend you were one character. You needed to fill up your whole collector's case at the back here. And in fact, the more elaborate collector's cases came with stickers that would put the names of all of the possible characters inside of the little cells, so that you knew you had to get mom or dad to take you back down to the store to fill out the rest of your case. Mm-hmm. So there's less investment there in embodying one character and more in acting out and being able to think about yourself as an actor over these characters. So as I was putting together, and here you get one view of the final case with 139 objects that we were able to put on display at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, we were really thinking about how they get played with. And that also, I think, gives us some insight into how we imagine other worlds, because toys guide how the players position themselves in these space-themed stories. So carrying a ray gun means imagining oneself to be the hero, perhaps the villain, although the villain's gun was not often reproduced. Playing with a play set or with the action figures means acting out these space-themed scenes as the director of the actions, but these toys almost never suggest that the player take the point of view of the female lead or of the villain, of that other character, and so they say something, again, about who we think we are. And so in many ways, if we come back again, it all comes back to the ray guns. This real question of how we have imagined other worlds is really often as an extension or reflection of ourselves. And as I'm looking at this at the National Air and Space Museum, they reflect these ideas of who we are, how we see ourselves, or how we would like to see ourselves, more than any real ideas about other worlds. I think that when people think about what other worlds could be, it's usually it's based out of our limited experience of having to extrapolate from what we know. And so I'll end with a picture of me looking rather pleased in front of my completed case. The questions that historians ask at the Smithsonian dealing with these artifacts are really about thinking about not only how do we play with them and what are the other worlds that we imagine, but what does this tell us about ourselves. And so I hope that at some point when you have the chance, you'll come and stand where I'm standing, that you'll visit the museum and get to see a little bit of what we've done, read all the labels. And I hope that you've enjoyed getting to share some of it with me today.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. A kind of unexpected story and narrative about the things that a lot of our audience either played with or watched their friends or siblings play with, but a whole new way of looking at ourselves through these toys. Really fascinating. Thank you so much, Margaret. We do have time for one or two questions, so if you do have a question for Margaret, feel free to jump in and go ahead and ask them now. There's a question. We had a number of people getting very nostalgic. Actually, everyone
Yes.
at some point, because you really touched on a whole spectrum of toys that touch many generations. But Franzi in Minneapolis wants to know, as you watch people enjoy the exhibit, is it kids or adults who are enjoying it more?
Kids and adults look at different shelves because the adults look at the shelves of the toys they had as a kid, and they remember having this one or that one, and my friend down the street had that play set, and I remember really wanting that. And so we've got some of the more modern stuff down at the bottom. You can see that down here in the bottom corner, it just ended up on the very, very bottom. We have our Star Wars action figures, and that franchise has really been revived very recently. And I personally am a fan, and my 4-year-old son is a big fan of Star Wars, and so you regularly see little boys and girls sitting with their little noses pressed up against the glass at that floor level, enjoying our Star Wars action figures. So people look at things that nostalgia of being able to remember playing with something, I think is one of the ways that people often really connect with this.
A couple of quick questions. Well, they're not. The questions are quick. The answers may not be. A question from earlier about space fiction and when it was really popularized. Did it start in the 40s or 50s? And if so, is there a particular reason why?
There's space fiction that starts as early as the late 19th century, and there are all kinds of stories where you can look back in many cultures, imagining going into space, imagining trips to the moon. Jules Verne, the French author, wrote a classic piece, From the Earth to the Moon, around the time of the American Civil War. So there are people as early as the 1860s, and he actually had some rather realistic ideas about going into space, and that was an important part. It gets revived in different ways at different times, and so there's a lot of this very fantastical stuff in the 1930s, I think very escapist in the midst of the Depression. There's a revival of space science fiction around the time that Wernher von Braun and his space boosters are putting forward some of this more realistic stuff, and I think it comes out of that same interest at that same moment. And then Star Wars is a real game changer in 1977, especially in terms of the merchandising and the toys and the 3D objects that get created. All of a sudden, the owners of Buck Rogers, the owners of Flash Gordon, the owners of any other space-related franchise suddenly revive it in the late 1970s as they realize that the popularity that had been faded since the 50s suddenly roars back with the popularity of Star Wars in 1977, and so into the 1980s there's a real revival of space science fiction. And I think we saw clips from Avatar in our last presentation, a really imaginative envisioning of another world and what it might be like to have real encounters with a completely other culture.
Well, one final note, a number of people, both wondering if they can come and actually play with the toys, but secondly, yes. When you look at pop culture today and look at acquiring new items for your collection, you're looking at things like Avatar that you mentioned, or Wendy was talking about the growing prevalence of women superheroes. how do you decide what to collect? Is your collection growing every day? Do you buy every latest sci-fi thing?
We can't buy every latest thing, and I don't have a purchasing budget, so I depend on the kindness of strangers. If people have good collections and they offer them to the museum, then we'll often consider them. The litmus test for me is how does it relate to visions of spaceflight? So we can't take everything that's fantastical. For instance, there are often robots in space science fiction, but not all robots are space related, so that becomes one of my decision points. But we are looking at more current franchises. We have a wonderful collection of Babylon 5 memorabilia that we acquired from the J.M. Straczynski series that was in the 1990s. Has a great vision of a world cultures meeting in space. And so we are continually collecting both older items and also newer items so that we're trying to keep up with some of these new visions of spaceflight. But that imagination of possible spaceflight and space exploration becomes the major decision point for me. Does it illustrate that? And that's really what makes a decision about whether it ends up in the collection or not.
Well, I will echo comments like Mark's, who said that this was great. We agree, Mark. Thanks so much to you and to everyone for joining us, and to each of you who are continuing to share your own relationship with the items that we're seeing in this collection, and in fact kind of trying to better understand yourselves by your own attraction or not to these items and what they say about us as individuals and as people. So thank you so much, Margaret. We want to encourage you to join us again in an hour, where we're going to be meeting with Phil Sadler, who is going to help us grasp the vastness of the universe, a real nice way to kind of bridge our first two topics together. By the way, I've put a link up on the top left corner, a place to click where it says evaluation, and just give us some feedback about the session we just experienced with Margaret. For those of you who were here for our first session, I neglected to put that evaluation up, and I'm putting that over on the lower right corner of the screen. That's for Lisa's session, so take some time during the break to give us some feedback for both. We do appreciate it so much. Also, don't forget, we do have a discussion area on the site, and this is a great place to continue the dialogue, continue sharing. You can put links in there to some of your favorite photos on Flickr, for example, or anywhere else that kind of help us discuss or continue to explore these topics. There's a discussion topic associated with each of our 12 sessions during the conference, so look for the one for this one to keep that going. Also, Margaret has graciously provided a virtual exhibit hall where you can find more resources, links, even a PowerPoint presentation with some great images for you to enjoy. So check that out and all of the other exhibit hall content. And I think I'm going to give you all a break, but I'm going to bring up on the screen a picture that our friend Dan Porter captured during our last hour. This is a picture of How Have We Imagined Other Worlds, and this is Dan's rendering of that wonderful session. So if you missed it, this might be an incentive to go check it out and see how this drawing came to life during Lisa's session. And we'll post in just a few minutes his imaginative capture of this imaginative session by Margaret. Okay, enjoy the break. We'll be back in 59 minutes with Phil Sadler, and thanks for being here.